Hi, I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host for Old Ways in New Jersey, here on East Brunswick Television. Today, I want to talk with you about Hurricane Sandy, otherwise known as Superstorm Sandy. It was the most destructive hurricane of the 2012 Atlantic hurricane season, as well as the second costliest hurricane in U.S. history. The storm became the largest Atlantic hurricane on record as measured by diameter, with winds spanning 1,000 miles. Estimates across damage have been over $68 billion, a total surpassed only by Hurricane Katrina. At least 286 people were killed along the path of the storm in 7 countries. In the United States, Hurricane Sandy affected 24 states, including the entire eastern seaboard, from Florida to Maine and west across the Appalachian Mountains, even as far as Michigan and Wisconsin, with particularly severe damage in New Jersey and New York. The storm surge hit New York City on October 29th, flooding streets, tunnels, subway lines, and cutting power in and around the city. I'm here in the studio today with Gina Sesta, who's currently a senior at Rutgers University majoring in American Studies. Gina has had firsthand experience with Superstorm Sandy. Her hometown is Point Pleasant, New Jersey, which suffered extensive damage in the storm. She's written her senior honors thesis at Rutgers on Superstorm Sandy, and she's become something of an expert on the topic. So it's my pleasure to welcome Gina Sesta to our studio today. So Gina, tell us, how did you come across the topic of Superstorm Sandy for your senior thesis at Rutgers?
So I actually am from Point Pleasant and have lived there for the past about 15 years. Mm-hmm. So I was able to pretty much see the storm itself and the consequences of it firsthand and see how it affected myself and my family and my neighbors. So I found it to be pretty interesting. So you're a first-hand observer? Yes. Okay. And what benefits, if any, were there from investigating something that happened so very recently? Well, there was a little bit of difficulty because there's not too many scholastic articles on it just yet, but what was helpful was that actually in the middle of my research, the year anniversary passed, so there was a lot of newspaper articles and other information. It was kind of interesting to see you're researching something as it's happening almost, because the recovery process is still going on. So it's in the middle of it happening that I was researching. So a lot of your sources were journalistic rather than scholarly? Yes, there's a lot of newspaper articles and interviews. And this Superstorm Sandy, as I understand it, went all the way from the Caribbean to Canada mm-hmm. over several countries. Did you focus on a particular location? I focused mainly just on New Jersey, yeah. And specifically the coastline and the shore areas, all of the beach towns. So, did you, in your research, find out why New Jersey has rarely experienced such a severe storm? So, usually, where New Jersey is located, it really doesn't get hit by anything like this, but there was a very unusual blocking pattern. So instead of the storm going out to sea, how it normally would have, that because of different pressure levels, it was blocked and got pushed into our coast.
It hugs the coast Friday into Saturday, but look at what happens as we head into early next week. The worst case scenario right now, moving right into millions upon millions of people. And this could cause extensive, catastrophic damage. I'm not just standing here making this stuff up. I want people to really pay attention to this because, again, this could be worst case scenario.
So it's very unusual for it to happen, but
So normally it would hit like Florida.
Right. It would go south or even go out to sea. It wouldn't usually come to us.
Now, from what I've been reading, some commentators attribute some of this to global warming. Do you find any substantiation for that?
They don't have anything totally concrete about it yet, but there is still a lot of research going on about it with global warming, and the Arctic sea ice melting is playing a huge part, because with all of the ice melting, the sea levels are rising. So that results in a lot more flooding to happen during these storms. So storms basically have three main components of them, hurricanes and big storms like this: rain, wind, and surge. And Hurricane Sandy didn't have too much rain, didn't have too much wind, but it was the surge that really was the driving factor of all the damage. So this could also be mainly attributed to the global warming and the sea level rising, because it was so much more water that was being dealt with. And also there was the rare occurrence that it was taking place in such warm waters, and it was also high tide. So with all of those things combined, it really made the surge to be the most powerful component of it.
So in your opinion, there is some weight on the side of global warming contributing to this? And in what I've read, I see sometimes it's referred to as Hurricane Sandy and sometimes Superstorm Sandy. Can you explain the difference?
So technically, it's actually classified as a superstorm.
When it hit New Jersey.
Right, when it hit the coast. When it was out at sea, it was still a hurricane, but by the time that it came to us, the winds weren't as strong and the rain wasn't as strong to be technically classified as a hurricane. So a superstorm is kind of just a smaller hurricane. So.
And what are the insurance implications for that distinction?
So a lot of insurance companies don't actually want to cover hurricanes because it's such extensive damage. Since it was technically classified as a superstorm, there was a lot more to be covered by insurance. A lot of homeowners found themselves lucky in a sense there.
Within New Jersey, what places suffered the most extensive damage, would you say?
Some places, such as barrier islands, so places where the ocean's on one side and the bay is on the other side, places like Maniloking and Long Beach Island, because also, again, going back to the flooding and the surge, the bay and the ocean actually met in these places, so all the land in between was completely flooded.
And obviously, anybody reading the papers knows that tourism was affected. Can you elaborate on that?
So a lot of these places have boardwalks: Point Pleasant, Seaside Heights, Seaside Park, and a lot of these boardwalks were pretty destroyed, if not completely destroyed. So being that this is pretty much the driving factor of New Jersey's economy in these places, it was a very big deal that this happened in late October. So they really, with the cold months, and then only a few months after that, they didn't have too much time to rebuild. So there was a big rush to rebuild, which was good and bad, because in some places things were overlooked, like the Seaside Heights fire that was attributed to not a very close inspection of the electric wires, because they got hit with all the salt water. So that caused a fire later. And so things like that were overlooked with tourism, that there could have been a lot more inspection, that there was such a rush to rebuild because it brings in so much money, and they really wanted to get it back up for the summer.
So if I hear you correctly, the state put more emphasis on the boardwalk and the tourist attractions than they did on the individual homes?
Yeah, I don't think anyone wants to totally admit that, but it definitely is visible, seeing that there are still homes that haven't been rebuilt and are still, people are still misplaced, but all the boardwalks have been running for, this will be the second summer now.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit, I may have told you, I saw a T-shirt that said, "Restore the shore, me first."
Right.
So it's a problem. You can't restore everything at once.
Right.
Yeah. So they made a big effort to restore the boardwalks. What about the beaches themselves?
So the beaches found themselves in a very, having a very weird appearance, because some places there were such huge drop-offs from the surge being so strong with all the sand. They tried to restore them the best that they could, but again, it's Mother Nature that is the opposing force, so they could really only do so much. They tried to kind of make a more even distribution of the sand after that, but with the ocean still coming in, it was a little difficult.
Did the Army Corps of Engineers try to dredge up sand and replace?
Yeah, and then they tried to do things like dunes and replenish the dunes and everything like that. So that was probably a little bit more difficult to handle than the actual establishments, because they can be rebuilt, but the beach is a little...
Well, we talked about the boardwalks and we talked about the beaches. What about the homeowners?
So the homeowners, it kind of almost depends where you are, because in places such as Point Pleasant and Seaside, Maniloking, a lot of the homes are starting to be rebuilt because these are tourist attractions, so they do want the towns to look a little bit nicer. Places like Union Beach, where not too many people visit, they find that there's a lower rate of restoration that's happened so far. So that gets a little tricky, but there's also a ton of new codes and laws that you need to abide by when rebuilding, so it's taking them a long time to actually rebuild and restore.
And in your opinion, how effective have these relief programs been?
Well, FEMA came in and did what they could. There has been money donated and generated to help restore homes. Most of the money has gone to the boardwalk and places that will generate more money out of it, but FEMA did come in and took a look at all of the different houses that are along the shore, but they only would give money to people who had their primary residences being located in these towns, so anyone with a secondary home really didn't get any relief.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it was mainly primary, which makes sense, but it's a tough situation. It slows down rebuilding.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned before, but we should elaborate a bit. What were the new architectural guidelines, basically?
So some towns are going as far as to trying to push people back to not rebuild so close to the shore. That's really difficult to do, but at the very least, most towns have a minimum requirement of having to lift the homes. So this can be anywhere from 4, 6, 8 feet. So homes are actually being like completely lifted off the ground. And then they have new architectural, some people are building type of porches downstairs. That way if the water comes through, nothing totally valuable gets washed out, or it's just solid brick. So it's all different stuff like that. Mainly it's lifting the homes.
Well, what I've heard is that some homeowners have been, in effect, required to raise their homes.
Yes.
Not so much necessarily the township required it, but the insurance company required it.
Right. Well, they won't cover it if something does happen again, and especially they have at the very least, they are required to raise their air conditioning units because that can cause a huge fire with the water.
So yeah, I talked to one homeowner. He said that it's very expensive to raise his house,
yes.
But it's even more expensive if he doesn't, because then the insurance would be prohibitively expensive. Right. So it's sort of economics as much as regulation. Right?
Yes.
Well, what happens to those unfortunate people who cannot afford to raise their house or to rebuild?
A lot of people are being forced to sell and move out, which is causing a pretty large change in demographics that you find in these towns, because a lot of these beach houses have just been passed through generations.
Some of them are just fishing shacks.
Yeah, and but they can sell for a large amount of money
because of the value of the land.
Right, because they're so close to the shore, and beachfront property is valuable. So people who can't afford to make these changes are being forced to sell and move inland. So it's kind of a shame that you see people who have been there, families for generations and years, are being forced to move. So
and where do they end up?
Somewhere cheaper.
Somewhere
inland away from the shore, because beachfront property is expensive.
And getting back to the problem of the beaches, what can be done to restore the beaches or to ensure that they're more storm resistant?
They have different dune programs. So they try to replenish the dunes, rebuild the dunes. This is also a little bit of a problem with homeowners because they're not the most physically attractive things. A lot of people who have beachfront property, the dunes actually block their view from the ocean. And if you're paying that much money to have beachfront property, they're not happy with the dunes being there. But in a sense, they are protecting their home. So it's a tough balance. Then there's also seawalls, which are actually placed in the sea but need to be dug very, very deep. So it's a very expensive project. So.
I see these signs, you're not supposed to walk on the dunes.
No.
Why is that?
I'm not entirely sure, but I think because it kind of messes up the distribution that they have going. Yeah. And it's built in a certain way to, if the water hits it, it's not going to totally wash out if people...
And they plant seagrass in those dunes. Yeah. So where has the money come from? Is it federal money or is it state money or what's, do you know?
I think there's a bit of both. I know the state asks for federal money, and then there's different, again, there's also different smaller relief programs within communities that try and raise money. So taxes are a huge thing as well. So yeah, a lot of money comes from that.
So it's now been about 1.5 years since the storm. How do things look?
It depends in which areas. Some places look exactly the same that they did the day after or a week after the storm hit. So a lot of houses still aren't rebuilt, and then there are people who can afford it and have rebuilt, and things look back to normal.
Can you give me an example of each?
Well, I know particularly in my town, Point Pleasant, it depends kind of where you are, but closer to the boardwalk, mostly everything's pretty restored. The boardwalk's back to normal. Many of the houses are back to normal. Of course, there are a few houses here and there that still need to be rebuilt, but I know in other places, more northern beaches like Union Beach aren't as rebuilt.
So what is the cultural influence of Superstorm Sandy on New Jersey and New Jerseyans?
From Superstorm Sandy, we've actually seen a huge community outreach, and New Jersey pretty much there's already been like a reputation of New Jersey being united, but they've really come together as a state with slogans like Restore the Shore and everything like that. A lot of people still came to visit, everyone really united as part of New Jersey. Everyone had a story to tell about the storm or a story to tell about a memory they had at the shore. So a lot of people were affected by the storm if they were actually there or not. So there's a big cultural community.
Well, do you have any story, a personal story about the storm?
Well, I know my parents, I stayed at school for it because it just was the smarter thing to do. My parents were there for it, and I went to my sister's who lives on McGuire Air Force Base, and we were on the phone with my mom, and we were trying to tell her like what we're seeing on the news. They were out of power for 2-3 weeks, and we were trying to tell her like what the town was looking like, and she just wasn't getting it. Like, you're like, no, Mom, you're not understanding. It's gone. Like, things are gone. Like, the Maniloking Bridge is underwater, and she just, it was very weird that they were totally in the dark about it.
Oh, because they weren't getting TV.
Right. They didn't have any way to know. So, and it was weird when I finally did get the chance to go home. There were boats in the middle of the road, and it was a disaster zone. So
I understand that Rutgers University provided some emergency housing for Sandy victims.
Yeah, and we also did, I know through the Student Volunteer Council how they have alternative breaks. We did a lot of trips down to the shore to help volunteer our time to rebuild things and clean up. So,
from your research, how likely is it that another such storm may hit New Jersey?
They don't have exactly, they can't call it like a 100-year storm or 50-year storm, but they do believe that it most likely will be seen again in our lifetime or something very similar to it, because as the sea levels continue to rise and global warming and all the different circumstances continue to happen, that it's just going to repeat itself, and storms that may not have been as severe in the past are going to start to look more like Sandy's.
Well, if it's true that we could expect a similar storm within our own lifetimes, what is it that we could do to prepare for such a storm?
The biggest thing to do is to rebuild smarter. I found a lot in my research through the Army Corps of Engineers and other engineering companies that they're just finding ways to rebuild with more resilience, such as lifting the houses and different opportunities like that that can just rebuild stronger instead of rebuilding fast to make it look exactly the same. Rebuild in a smarter way.
Well, with all things considered, do you think it's better to rebuild or to retreat?
I personally think it's better. It's a little bit of both would be smart. In areas maybe such places like LBI, certain areas in LBI are just, they flood when there's a regular thunderstorm. So in some places it's probably better to retreat. In other places it is possible to rebuild if you rebuild smart. Things like this are going to keep happening, so I think people just need to be aware of that when they make their decisions.
Gina, where did the storm actually originate?
So the storm originated in the Western Caribbean, so the Bahamas, Kingston, Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and then came to land in Brigantine, New Jersey, and it came in with 80-mile-per-hour winds. So
that's pretty destructive.
Yes.
Because I know even here in East Brunswick, it blew down my backyard fence. Right. Well, what about loss of power?
There were 10 million customers that were out of power for different periods of time, and they actually had to bring in crews from all over to try and get it restored fast.
Yeah, I know. My own house in East Brunswick, we were without power for 10 days.
Right.
And finally it was restored, and I asked the utility crew where they were from. They said they were from Tampa, Florida.
Right.
So I assume people were coming from all over.
Yeah, the response actually was fairly quick when it came to restoring power. People were out for up to about a month, but compared to other storms, it was relatively quick.
I understand there was a big center in Edison where they put up these out-of-state utility crews with food and lodging. I'm sure the airports were affected. Can you tell us about that?
There were about 5,000 flights that were canceled as a result of Sandy.
I'm sure that resulted in a great deal of inconvenience. Well, certainly the barrier islands would be affected, places like Ship Bottom. What happened there?
Barrier islands were actually ordered by the mayor to evacuate, and then there were different towns, such as in Ocean County, that were suggested to evacuate, but it wasn't mandatory.
But the barrier islands were mandatory?
Yes, they were mandatory.
Okay. And what about school closings?
I believe it was 509 out of the 580 schools in New Jersey were closed.
So I think it's safe to say that's most schools were closed.
Yeah.
And what was the impact in New York City?
New York City did also see damage. Some of the subways were closed. The Holland Tunnel was closed. The Brooklyn Battery Tunnel was closed. There are images of the subways being completely flooded. So New York did see damage as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it would certainly be inconvenient if you're trying to get from Brooklyn to Manhattan, or certainly from New Jersey to Manhattan.
Right.
And what about the death toll?
I believe there were 72 deaths in total from coming from 8 different states. So that's, compared to other storms, not quite as bad, but it has been the most since 1972 from Hurricane Agnes. It's
Well, Gina, I want to thank you for coming to East Brunswick today and sharing your knowledge of Superstorm Sandy. It's been very enlightening.
Thanks.